Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Org Group's webinar called The New Administration's Impact on the Sector. Today, we'll discuss what's happening in and around the White House and what we foresee coming down the pipe. Want to thank you all for joining us today. We have about 660 people registered and from around the world dialing in today. Stacy and Shannon, you are very popular people. I could imagine your birthdays must be 500 people plus too. Love it. Well, thank you both for joining and spending time with us today. So some administrivia before we get into the topic at hand. The agenda will be as follows. We'll have an intro shortly, then we'll go into a quick summary of what's already come out of the White House or legislation that's being discussed, and then we'll have our panel session, and then we'll wrap up with some Q&A. So anytime you have a question in the presentation, please put it in the chat box. My colleague Campbell Lake is behind me here, literally behind the scenes and behind the wall, and is collecting the questions. We'll then go over them in the last 15 minutes of the webinar. So my team is recording this. They've also been explicit, Shannon and Stacy, no curse words, so we'll have to keep on our best behavior here. No promises, we'll see. But after this, we'll send the recording with a little summary for everyone here to share. One additional important note, no one on this call is a licensed attorney. No one is a representative of a government agency or official in the administration. The information shared here is for general purposes only, and definitely should not be considered legal or official advice. How can you tell? I have my lawyer right there for me. So with that legal mumbo jumbo behind us, let's jump in and have some fun. I'd like to start by introducing our two panelists. I'm thrilled to be joined here by Stacy Palmer, the CEO of the Chronicle Philanthropy, and Shannon McCracken, the CEO of Nonprofit Alliance, TNPA for short. Stacy, would you mind start and giving us a quick introduction?
Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm Stacy Palmer, and I helped found the Chronicle of Philanthropy in 1988. So we've been covering all of these ups and downs in the federal government and its relationship to the social sector for a long time. So I'm delighted to bring perspective to today's conversation.
Amazing. Thank you, Stacy. And Shannon, the same.
And I'm delighted to be joining Stacy and CJ here today. I'm Shannon McCracken, the CEO of the Nonprofit Alliance, which is a trade association for nonprofits and firms that work with nonprofits. And I've been here for about 7 years. And prior to that, the first 25 years of my career, I was on the fundraising side with large organizations. So I've been in those shoes, worn that hat.
Very nice, thank you. And my name is CJ Orr. I'm the CEO of Org Group. Org Group is a consulting firm that works exclusively with nonprofit organizations to help them grow. We do that through strategy, fundraising, HR, recruiting, operations, and project management services. So we're a team of 75 professionals. I'm joined by several of them today who are listening in. So thank you to those who are joining. The nonprofits we work with are here in the U.S. and abroad, and we know we have many of them who have, our clients, have joined us today. So thank you to them who have joined. So with intros done, let's talk about this new administration. What a few weeks it has been. What I'm going to do here is outline just what has already been shared, and then some other stuff that some other talking points that have been discussed in the sector. So there are really two big issues that we've been hearing a lot about that have been front and center with the new administration, and that's DEI and government funding. So let's start with DEI. There have been 6 official executive orders that speak to DEI, but there's probably one that says it succinctly and with the following statement. I therefore order all executive departments and agencies to terminate all discriminatory and illegal preferences, mandates, policies, programs, activities, guidance, regulations, enforcement action, consent orders, and requirements. I further order all agencies to enforce our longstanding civil rights laws and combat illegal private sector DEI preferences, mandates, policies, programs, and activities. That one came from the executive order directly, and I just wanted to share that here. So to summarize, Trump signed this executive order terminating a lot of DEI programs within the federal agencies. And then the federal agencies have also been instructed to identify and recommend investigations into other organizations that do provide DEI practices. The enforcement, the last sentence of this, of the private sector activities, is going to be interesting to see how that evolves and plays out. Few words, significant impact. Even before the election, we're seeing a clash against programs or opportunities for one subset of people that don't include access for all individuals. We saw this in the Fearless Fund case. We saw this in the banning of affirmative action. We saw this with companies pulling back on DEI commitments. And the number of companies that have pulled back, or the list is long, like McDonald's, Nike, Deere, Meta, Target, et cetera. Given the new administration's clear opinion on DEI, this definitely is going to impact our sector. And I think we'll continue to see some companies pulling back on their giving. Also, just a lot of nonprofits have DEI lens to their work. So this is going to be a little tricky to navigate. We'll get into that in a minute. The other big part of the executive orders is the freezing of federal funding or grants. So the first executive order that we saw come out a couple weeks ago is called reevaluating and realigning the United States foreign aid. That calls for a 90-day pause in program, 90-day pause in foreign aid, and then the Office of Management and Budget (OMB) came out with a temporary pause on all activities related to the obligation or disbursement of all federal financial assistance. So this was then challenged by a judge, and we'll get into that in a minute. But that one is still in process, and a lot of things going on over there. Outside of the executive orders focusing on DEI and spending, there was also a lot of executive orders that related to climate, transgender rights, education, and more. And we'll continue to watch these as these evolve. Outside of the executive orders over the past few months, there's been a lot of also talk about what else is going to happen. And so I just want to provide a few things that we've been hearing and some things that the Chronicle has definitely been reporting on, so we can just level set. One of those is that some Congress folks are working on building a bipartisan support for the charitable deduction for non-itemizers. So that would be great for smaller donors and helpful to the sector. There's also a push, or there's been discussion about removing tax-exempt status for business-like charities, such as hospitals, insurance companies, and universities. Another thing we're hearing, in particular from J.D. Vance, is the taxation of endowment income, particularly from larger universities. This one, I hope, is all just talk, but we'll see where that leads to. There's also some discussion about bringing back regulations to require distributions from DAFs. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then there's also the law that came out a couple months ago called HR 9495, which allows the IRS to revoke the 501(c)(3) status of any organization deemed to be involved with terrorist activities. So all of those latter ones that I've been discussing have been talked about, and some of them have become law. Some are just still discussions. So first, let's talk about DEI. I'm going to, Stacy, ask you first. You all have been reporting on this topic for a long time now. Many folks on this call have missions or programs that directly help minorities or other programs that might fall under what might be called DEI related. What would your general advice be to these organizations?
Yeah, this is a really tricky topic at this moment because we don't have enough information. So as you said at the beginning, this is one of those ones where you want to talk to a lawyer and help make sure that the wording you use in describing your mission and programs and those kinds of things don't inadvertently run afoul of something that might cause a lawsuit or that kind of thing. Now, many foundations especially have come out very strongly in response to what the administration said. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, for example, said, our mission has always been about healthcare and particularly serving people who have been left out of the healthcare system and who the system has hurt in various ways. So they're not backing down, and they're coming out with statements to say, we are going to continue this. This is a really important thing. So even though we see a lot of companies in their philanthropic commitments backing down, there are an equal number, I would say, that are also steadfast in it. I think there was a story today that the NFL is going to make sure that it continues to follow its diversity efforts. So I wouldn't say, that everybody is sitting back, but thinking carefully. And one of the things that is always smart to do is talk about things with a bit of data. So if your mission is about making sure that children are healthy and it's a certain cadre of children who maybe fall in the income scale in a certain place or in a certain region that has been left behind, you can talk about things that way and still probably carry out your mission in various ways. One of the things after the affirmative action decision came out, lawyers suggested that, if let's say you had a scholarship program that was largely designed to benefit Hispanic people, you could say not that you're only looking for Hispanic applicants, but that the cause is about making sure that Hispanic research is done well. And you will probably, in the very instance of putting out that application, be able to attract people. So some of it is just thinking about the wording. I think the part that's tricky for people is that right now we don't have full guidance on what the administration meant. So I think it's worth asking a bunch of questions. I don't think it means retreating from the mission. It's really how we talk about it and implement it that we have to be careful about.
Stacey, it's great advice. And Shannon, I go to you as well with a similar questions. Is that the right advice that organizations maybe talk about their messaging a little bit different, but don't go change programs or missions? What about maybe an organization that just has a DEI committee? What do they do with that? How deep does this go for nonprofits?
Excellent questions, CJ, and Stacey made excellent points as well. There's not a one size fits all answer right now, right? So what I would say is that we know that the law is being read and understood differently than it was a few weeks ago, even. We also know that organizations that have DEI statements and more to the effect DEI commitments and initiatives put those in place not overnight. There was a process, a very deliberate, thoughtful, inclusive process, thinking about who needed to be at the table, what's constructed, what's included in that, what is the communication strategy, both internally and externally, as you were putting those commitments and those initiatives into place and rolling those out. What was the feedback loop for that? What was your process for evolving that policy as your programs changed? If you've had your DEI, if you've been doing DEI work within your organization for more than a couple of years, then you've likely revisited this and evolved it. So using that same process, now calculating or including other factors in your risk assessment with your DEI, looking at what your profile is, exactly to the points that Stacey was making, how embedded is the work that you're doing with your mission versus an internal staff culture piece versus how you're talking to your constituents and donors and stakeholders. Look at all those variants. And I would say really consider the language and terminology you're using, because some of the words that you thoughtfully selected, some time ago, a few years ago, it's not that you're backing off of those, but the understanding of the meaning of those words has changed. Words have become politicized or just used differently in everyday conversation. So make sure the terms that you're using still mean today what you intend them to mean as you go forward. And include your counsel, include your head of HR, include your board, everybody who needs to be at the table in making these decisions and rolling them out. And your decision may be no change at all, or it may be something more than that.
Yeah, I actually heard you both say consult lawyers and our advice. Hey, this might be a good couple of years for lawyers. So Stacey, we've seen for several months, companies pulling back on their DEI commitments made over the past few years. And now companies are being sued for funding or providing grants to individuals of one ethnicity. Like, for example, I was just reading about McDonald's. They got sued by the American Alliance for Equal Rights for their HACER National Scholarship Program, which provides scholarships to Hispanic and Latino students, and they've been doing this for 30 years. And so as a result, what they've done is change their application to be for anyone who's had an impact on the Hispanic or Latino community through their activities and leaderships. So if an organization on this call used to get or is about to get into a renewal conversation with a corporate funder, how do you recommend they approach that conversation?
Yeah, I think it's sort of the same thing we were just talking about, is to ask, sort of what their values are and what kinds of things they're using to guide them, and, really what their objectives are, because there are ways to do some of the kinds of things that people have had long-standing practices, but it's how it's structured. It might be about the selection process, criteria, and the committee. So there may need to be adjustments, but it may not mean, fully pulling back. Obviously, companies that care deeply about their relationship with the federal government, with consumers, are thinking about it through that lens. And you've seen Costco, for example, be very strong in saying that it is going to, continue with its diversity efforts. So it's not that there's, just one approach in corporate America. So it's really looking at the companies that have said we're sticking to it and seeking support from them. At least at this moment, I would at least put all of my activity into those that have declared that they're standing by what they said they were going to do.
Great. So Shannon, an organization that usually would get money from a corporation and they're going to have to look elsewhere, what other avenues for fundraising would you recommend?
I think the same question you'll be able to ask multiple times through, as we're talking about the issues today and talking about risks to revenue streams, right? I think we've all seen many times in the past 2 weeks, people talking on LinkedIn or in conversations like, well, then there should just go to your donors. You should always have been relying on your individual donors more. And yes, and also we're all aware of the data around declining giving, declining number of households. If it were that easy, we would all be doing it. So, yes, maybe there's a change in investment, that you do put more investment into that pot of growing your donor relationships and expanding your donor audiences and thinking about how you do that. That's not a light switch. If funding that you were counting on getting this year is now suddenly not happening for reasons that you're talking about, then, then there's a lead up time for that. I think we will start to see coming out of in the next few months, we may start to see some different funding models being tested by organizations. Partnerships, joint ventures, fee-for-service programs, perhaps places that organizations have dabbled in or thought about, but not really gone there. And just it is time to rethink some of the models and reduce some of our risk from certain places, whether that's corporate giving or federal funding or any others.
Yeah, and Shannon, I have you one other quick question. So the TNPA promotes, protects, and strengthens the nonprofit sector. I think you're in front of the right crowd today. What if an organization disagrees with what's happening? What can they do to say something or do something about it?
Yeah, right now, a lot of the work that we're doing, and different groups are doing different things. There are a lot of hands and legs and work to go around. The approach that TNPA is taking right now is working, and we have bipartisan relationships in Congress, do a lot of our work on the Hill. We're working particularly with Republican senators right now, where Republicans have more of the strength and influence, and really coordinating with them on helping them see some of the risk and some of the threat to nonprofits, to causes they care about within their communities, within their states, affecting their constituents, and aligning with them. So it's you can go onto the U.S. Senate page. There are contact pages for every senator. Really easy to fill out the form and just share some of the impacts you're seeing. Those data points, and include data points, by the way. Storytelling's lovely, but data points are what will carry the day right now. Keep it short, 2 or 3 paragraphs, does not need to be an essay, and really just quantify some of what is happening to your organization, some of what you're struggling with, and what the impacts will be. Number of people served, programs that are cut, employees in their state who will lose their jobs. Those are the factors that will help activate senators around our support.
Thank you for that advice, and thank you for what you're doing. Okay, so let's move on to the second big topic, government funding. So Stacy, having read through your articles, I think you quoted that 27% of nonprofits receive some type of government funding. we've been whiplashed a little bit of what's going on in the news over the past week. No new funding for foreign aid, or now no funding. And then you have the judge that's blocking this and coming. I mean, yesterday there was news. I'm not going to try to summarize it. I'm actually going to ask you. So what's going on here? What's been the bouncing ball? And then where does that leave us today?
So this is going to be a continuing difficult challenge, no matter what. Each judge will rule something. There'll be some victories, there'll be some setbacks, but this is going to be in play for a while. So I think everybody has to understand that they should really think hard about where their federal money is coming from. Even though the judge blocked yesterday, said, you know, this does not hold water. This is not a legal approach to doing things. You know, I'm still seeing reports that places like Head Start are not able to get money that they expected to be able to get. So you know, the system itself is not working well, even under the best of circumstances. It's chaotic, it's messy, and everybody should have contingency plans that it's going to stay that way. Coming up, you know, there's debt ceiling debates and all those things. I wouldn't be surprised if we have a government shutdown. There are a lot of things that are just going to put federal money, you know, up in the air. So, you know, I'm thrilled to see actually nonprofits are leading in a lot of the efforts to have these courthouse battles. They were ready to go. They had been preparing for months. They knew this kind of thing was going to happen, and they, you know, have had some really incredible court victories. It's also been an advocacy victory. I mean, we all saw, you know, last week when the federal funding was threatened, you know, I think every member of Congress was getting inundated with calls about what this means. Every television station was covering, here's what it means for our community. And that's why you quickly saw, you know, a turnaround. But, you know, I think it would be foolish to think this is going to evaporate soon. So being prepared and really thinking about what your organization can do without the federal money, if it can, and finding at least, you know, lines of credit, working with the bank, working with your board, working with big donors, and to say, this is going to be a really unsettling time. We need some kind of a reserve fund to help get us through as we figure out what's going on.
I think all of those are great advice. Line of credit, bank, board, big donors, reserve fund, spot on. Okay, Shannon, similar question that I asked you previously. So look at for government funding related. So if organizations that receive government funding and are now not going to be, or depends on what happens, what can they do if to disagree or fight back or try to get the money flowing again?
Yeah, similar answer, really same answer that I gave last time, CJ, is focusing that messaging. And it's important that and I mentioned Republican senators earlier. If your state is a blue state, reach out to your Democrat senators too. They're all part of this process. There will need to be, you know, I expect there to be some bipartisan effort here. And so, you know, to really do that outreach. The other thing I will call out is, and again, putting my old fundraiser hat back on, but I'm starting to see some strong messaging from organizations who are reaching out with appeals to their donors as they're seeing that funding source cut off. And I know I just said easier said than done, but a couple points in that. One, it is a great time to reach out to donors and funders. Think about the messaging. So the appeal that I saw this morning, very strong one, and it specifically said, we lost this fund. Here's funding we lost already. Here's funding that is, you know, on hold right now and potentially at risk of not getting. Here's what this means to us. Here's what we won't be able to do. Will you consider right now stepping up and making a contribution? I want to call out that there is a large portion of the American public and of our donor public who believe that this country is spending too much money on international relief, for example. Now, they, by and large, have a exaggerated sense of how much of the national budget the federal budget is spent on international relief. That, you know, that belief is too high. The reality is much lower. Doesn't matter. That is their belief. So think about the messaging that you're using and how much you're really talking about the loss of government funding versus increased need versus, you know, the programming that you're trying to do. The Nonprofit Alliance did some public polling, public survey back at the very end of 2024. And it is not surprising, but we have some data behind it. Donors who already support and believe in and trust an organization are much more supportive of that organization receiving federal funding than just a broad answer, do you think nonprofits should receive federal funds. So the way that you are talking to your existing donors might be different than the way that you're talking to donors who haven't supported you in the past. They may be supportive of other cause areas receiving funding, but maybe haven't bought into yours yet being that one. So it's just thinking about audiences. Everybody's trying to move rapid fire right now, be the first ones out there, get ahead of this for their own budgets and their own boards, and just pausing that beat and thinking about how it's going to land. And the familiarity that the general public may have with this issue right now versus you who are living and breathing it every day.
Yeah, Stacey, a similar type question. For organizations that are losing their government funding, what are the other fundraising avenues that they should go after? Should be doing an emergency fund, or what else should they be thinking about?
I think one of the other important things is there's obviously the direct loss of funds. So that's about the 27% of groups, but there are many people who benefit from various programs who are also at risk. So in some ways, nonprofits have to be the voice of, these are the people that we care about in our communities and that we serve, and also brace for increased demand. So it's not just that we lost our funding, but we've got more people coming to our doors and expecting that. And I think that's something, Shannon's right. People don't understand some of these things. They don't know what the numbers are. They've been, they've heard a lot of the political rhetoric, so they don't necessarily know where the money is going and how much of a difference it makes. So constantly using those data points is really important. Diversifying fundraising, and Shannon's also right, it's not easy. We've seen a slide in the share of Americans who give, but certainly there's a great interest in making sure that people who are, in need of services get them. I think it's a bit more challenging. We're seeing a bit of a pitting between the very elite institutions and local community groups. So really explaining how the money is used will be very helpful. Thinking about getting board members to match gifts, doing those kinds of things to make the outreach, to be involved. Board members can be so influential. This is just a time where they really need to step up. We did a story recently on, the fact that 2025 is the year that boards really need to be there for their organizations, and, giving them lots of things that they can do really well. And clearly people are looking at more immediate kinds of funding. So even though you may have been thinking about doing a planned giving program, which is always smart to do, that's not going to help you right at this very moment. You need to do things that, really help, basic sort of annual fund type tactics at the moment to help get you through.
Great, thanks, Stacey. I heard you both talk about the importance of data, so that will be definitely a takeaway. So Shannon, if you took a look at some of the news over the weekend, there was a lot of talk about the future of USAID. And it seems, and for fair warning, these articles are not great news. So the news is that it seems like Trump, Musk, and some others at the efficiency or DOGE want it to be removed, shut down, or just non-existent. We'll see. But do you think that's going to happen? And then if so, what do you think is going to be the impact on the sector?
Well, I'll answer the last question first. If it is shut down, there will be huge impact on the sector. We looked at some analysis yesterday of some of the larger organizations. So you think of larger as having a bit more strength than reserves and so forth. And some of the larger organizations that receive funding through USAID, and looking at their working capital, they don't have, 90 days or 6 months of reserves to be able to just see through this, to continue in some of their program commitments. And that's where we're seeing already programs being shut down or paused or staff furloughed. And, while there's a little bit of a waiting game and sorting out here. So the impact on the organizations, the impact more importantly is on the work that the organizations are doing and those commitments that they have made that will absolutely suffer. We can say that safely because it's suffering today. It's already happening and it's so immediate. The likelihood that will happen, I would say there is very high likelihood that at the very least, the programs and the agency will have significant overhaul. and we have to, kind of take back some of the history. USAID was formed in 1961, I believe, by Kennedy. He did that because he was frustrated with the bureaucracy of the State Department and how he felt it was too slow to get funds out. And this was during the Cold War, and he was really trying to, to combat what was happening within Soviet space and so forth. So ever since then, there have been partisan opinions on the work of the USAID, the causes and work that they're doing and supporting. So it's not new that this is divisive. It's just new that such rapid and challenging, such an understatement word, but what we're seeing right now is just very different. And there's a whole other arena to get into here with who's being given access, who isn't being given access, the data security. There's a lot more there, but CJ, we're halfway through, so I'll pause.
Only so much time. Okay, very good. Thank you. So let's talk about next on our agenda here, big institutions. Stacy, you all wrote in the Chronicle a couple months ago, maybe a month or two ago, that there is a push in the government to remove the 501c3 status for business-like charities. Can you explain that? And has there been anything coming from the White House or DC indicating that this could be on the agenda?
Yeah. So the Tax Foundation is supporting this idea and working closely with a lot of Republican lawmakers to get across this idea that there are a lot of groups that have tax exempt status that in their view don't deserve it. So, it can be something like nonprofit hospitals that might seem really commercial, and just like a for-profit hospital, the NCAA, those kinds of things that we don't really necessarily think of in the same category as the food bank, but they are. And so there's been a lot of discussion about whether it's just time to just get rid of the tax exempt status altogether. So this idea is circulating. One of the things that I was starting to hear last fall was that there was an effort to really make sure that that was something that was understood among the Republican staff members, many of whom are new. And again, we continue to have a lot of new staff members. And that's another of those basic sort of lessons of lobbying and advocacy. Even though you think that you've gotten something done and you've explained something, there's just been an enormous amount of change in who understands this kind of thing. And you just have to keep explaining, this is how this works. This is why the tax exemption matters. This is the way to think about it. But it's be possible that there'd be some kind of reordering of who is eligible to have a tax exempt status. I don't think anybody would ever go so far as to get rid of the 501c3 unless, there's some major scandal that got in the way. I don't see that happening, but there's just a lot of suspicion of what does it mean to be tax exempt? What are the benefits? Why do we give them? Which goes along with suspicion of all government subsidies.
Very good. Thank you. Shannon, let's talk about the rumor about endowments potentially being taxed. Do you think there's anything to this, or do you think that this is just talk?
There could be something to this. Endowments are currently taxed, and this was part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. They're currently taxed at about 1.4%, at 1.4% on gains, but it's only affecting the very largest endowments. So like $500,000 per student kind of endowments. So there are about fewer than 60 institutions that are affected by this. What is being proposed or what is being floated is basically a 10-fold increase. So like a 14% tax on that gain, which is clearly significant. It would take the government share of that, or the intake of taxes from something like 70 million to 700 million. So significant. We'll be talking here in a minute, I know, about the Charitable Act and restoring a charitable tax deduction for all taxpayers. Where I think this endowments conversation could become interesting and really come into play for everyone, even non-education organizations, is if the government tries to use this as a little bit of leverage. Okay, nonprofit sector, you're asking us to take a significant $3.4 billion hit to restore a tax deduction. How are you going to help us pay for that? Maybe we could put a higher tax on endowments from your counterparts, and that'll help offset some of the cost and do a little bit of like splitting and pitting within the nonprofit sector. So that's just something to be on watch for, and a reason why all of us need to watch this, even if you're not holding a large endowment.
Okay. Let's talk about DAFs. Obviously, they have been over the years increasing in use and popularity in the sector. And Stacy, you all reported that there is some bipartisan support for encouraging required distributions from DAFs. Can you explain what's being talked about?
Yeah, as many people may know, donor advised funds are kind of an odd creature in the law. They didn't really get established in the way that foundations do. It was really sort of an IRS decision. And so one of the things that people have been suggesting is, why don't they have a payout requirement just as foundations do? Foundations have to distribute at least 5% of their assets every year. So should donor advised funds. There's no, you really don't ever have to give anything out of the fund. Now, a lot of people clearly do that, but there's no requirement that this money goes out the door. And now that donor advised funds have, as much as, the very biggest foundations in their assets, they're really important. And if that money's not going out the door, that means working nonprofits really don't have a chance to get those funds. So there's a lot of talk about whether it be a good idea to say there should be at least a minimum requirement. That idea of looking at foundations is a way of, thinking about it that would encourage things. One of the things that's difficult about regulating this field is there's some really, really big donor advised funds. And then there are a whole bunch of small ones. It's like the rest of the charitable world where you've got, very, very big ones. And so if 5% of their assets had to go out the door, that would be really significant funding.
Helpful. Shannon, do you think that this would be, or what are the pros and cons if this were to go through?
I think Stacy really touched on some of the pros of moving money through faster, so it's not sitting somewhere, so that it really is going to work right away. I wouldn't even necessarily say cons, but I would say considerations before we really rallied behind any sort of regulation or requirements for donor advised funds, is to really examine some of the use cases today. We look at these really big numbers and we think about, and of course the media likes to talk about, uber wealthy people who take a tax break, park all their money there, and then it's not doing any good at all. No sort of intent or near-term intent to distribute those funds to nonprofits who need the money today. That is not all of givers and not the way that all DAFs are being used. I was in a room with about 25 fundraising agency executives 2 weeks ago, and all of them were commenting on the significant increase in the number of DAF gifts, particularly at year end, that their clients across many cause areas, different sizes, were receiving. So, donors, everyday givers, are using their DAFs or appear to be using their DAFs in ways that we would support. People are setting up DAFs for different reasons. Families, instead of setting up family foundations as they may have a number of years ago, they're now using DAFs because they're easier. It removes some of that administrative burden of running or managing a foundation, and it gives their family some decision-making opportunities around how to give now and into the future. So there's that use case. There are people who, like we saw this in 2017 and 2018, as tax laws around charitable giving flex a little bit, and choosing to bunch their giving, putting money in all at once and then spending that out as they would have anyway. But putting it there and knowing that it's available and to distribute. DAFs there's data showing that DAFs are pushing out much more money than foundations are. It's more like 20+% for many of them. So just making sure whatever that required distribution is, that we're not creating a race to the bottom that actually slows down some of that. And to Stacy's point, then how do we really balance that for large DAFs versus smaller community-based ones to ensure that it's doing what we intend it to do? So like everything else we're talking today, not really straightforward and simple, but certainly something that I think will come up sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think that race to the bottom quote was a good one, right? If people are required to give 5%, they might just give 5% instead of maybe traditionally give 20%, right? Because they have that number in their head that they have to hit, and they will stick to that bottom. Very interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what you all are thinking is coming down the pike here. Stacy, what do you think we're going to see next from this administration?
Oh, yes, please,
That
Stacey.
is,
Write this down.
hey, probably 10 things happened while we were just on the
Right.
Zoom.
1:30 on February 4th for the recording here.
So, I think obviously we're going to see just, a lot of elimination of regulation institutions. There's talk about getting rid of the Department of Education now, was the popular thing yesterday. So, I think many of the kinds of things that organizations that are in the field that they have specific missions on, are going to come up. I don't know how many more things are going to be aimed at the nonprofit sector writ large, like we've seen with the foundations or other kinds of things like that. But each individual area and the causes that people care about, they're going to get hit in various ways, and need to defend themselves or talk about, what are the solutions we can have? If we agree that certain parts of our system are broken, can nonprofits be advocates for saying, here are some ideas that work, rather than always being in a position of saying, no, 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 don't change things. What have we learned in philanthropy and from the nonprofits doing the work that might be really positive ways to change how government works? I think there might be, some backlash if nonprofits are only seen as complaining, opposing, sort of that kind of thing. And there's plenty that they need to speak out about the impact on their causes and the people they serve, but also having some positive messages about like, well, here's another way to do it that we've proven works.
Great. Shannon, how about you?
Two call outs I would make here. One is, and on some of these issues like DEI, this is more relevant than others, but a word that I was hearing a lot last week was overcorrection. In the moment as we are maybe caught off guard, or something came on stronger or faster or harder than we expected it to, or there's this fear and this, real urgency around risk mitigation, there's an overcorrection by organizations that maybe don't need to be as concerned about certain things, or, and that can be understandable, but, monitoring for that, right? And also being willing to then backtrack a little bit when things calm down here, as they inevitably will at some point. We'll all be able to take a breath and reassess. So just kind of hold in the back of your mind, this is the action we need to take now, or we think we need to take now, and let's reassess in case it was an overcorrection. So I'd call out that. The other thing, and Stacey made fantastic points, and nonprofits exist because of the need and the support and the recognition by donors and other funders that nonprofits are a solution to a problem. And in many cases, are the best solution to a problem. The government through history has identified nonprofits as as their partners in solving some problems. And sometimes nonprofits are standalones that are formed out of a challenge or looking for a solution, and can be big drivers in that. Public support for nonprofits is what has always kept our doors open by and large. And that's who we need to look to right now, is look for that public support, continue to message to our donors about the important work that we're doing, even as these other threats and these other distractions are happening, really focusing on the positive of the work, the critical missions that we serve and the people that we serve, and keeping our eye on that ball as well. And making sure as long as that public support is there, then the nonprofit sector will continue to sustain.
Very good. I want to channel the inner accountants with you both. And soon there will be the renewal with some changes for the Trump tax cuts that went into place many years ago. Maybe Stacey, I'll start with you. Do you have an opinion on what new changes, particularly for the nonprofit sector, might be put into the new law when this renewal comes?
Sorry, what were you referring to?
For the Trump tax cuts that are
The
going
tax
to
cuts, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so
you see coming, you see that will put in there that'll impact the nonprofit sector.
yeah, I mean, for sure, it needs to be renewed or else it will expire. So we know there's going to be a tax conversation. And I think everybody was geared up for that one versus some of these other kinds of issues. There was a major impact already, with the move to the standard deduction. As we know, billions of dollars were lost to nonprofits when the standard deduction and the when everybody having access to a deduction went away. So now only about 9% of Americans have access to a charitable deduction. So, that's going to be certainly a discussion. Some of these things like the donor advised fund payout, the endowment tax, anything that's related to tax issues affecting nonprofits could all be thrown in there. There's going to be a need to pay for this effort and to think about it. So I would keep my eye on that one in a big way, because there's lots of different things that happen, and they often happen at the last minute. So making sure that you're really, talking to the people, especially if your member of Congress is on one of the tax writing committees, to be very close to the staff there and helping them understand what truly matters, because you may not have as much time to build support for it as you want. But right now would be the time to think about it, even though we really haven't heard a lot of talk about taxes at this moment, but we will.
Yeah, I think you're right. Shannon, what do you think?
Yeah, the universal charitable tax deduction is the one that we're really keeping our eye on. And as Stacy said, we expected it initially to come up pretty early in the new year in the new Congress, and now it'll be later than that. If there is something like a government shutdown, that's going to postpone it even more. It's sort of hard to project those timelines now. And we know there is that very hard stop on December 31st, that all of this expires if it's not done by then. So Congress has lots of motivation to get this done before then. We know charitable tax deduction will be part of that conversation, and just really echoing what Stacy said, to be ready for that, prepared for that, and also think about what concessions we're willing to make as we're looking for something like starting with $600 for married and $300 for single filers. Is there something there that we need to concede on, and just to get this through, or is that something that's hard and fast? Really, ultimately, we want to see it get written into code. Then we can come back later and work on increasing it. And then just a reminder to everyone, even more so than we expected, this is going to be a very Republican-driven tax discussion. And so again, helping your congressional leaders understand the impact of your work, not in a complaining way, not in an asking way, and really a reinforcing way. Here's how, here's the work that we're doing. Here's why public support is so important. And we need your government to support to ensure that that continues to fuel this work.
Shannon, over the next few months, how does TNPA get involved in those conversations?
So we have a lobbyist who's on the Hill every day, basically every day. We have opportunities for our members to get involved. We have Capitol Hill days. We have different calls to action. We have a couple on our website right now around the federal funding. If you go to tnpa.org/federal funding, you can find some updates and opportunities there. And we have an advocacy week coming up in April. So many of those events, we also participate in coalitions across the sector. So there's a charitable giving coalition where our Vice President of Government Affairs is one of the co-chairs of that steering committee. So there are lots of ways for TNPA members or others on this audience who are interested in getting more involved to reach out.
Great. Before I get to Q&A, is there anything that either of you want to discuss that we haven't discussed yet?
It's the one thing because we've been talking about advocacy throughout this conversation, and it's important to point out that sadly we've seen a real drop in the number of nonprofits that are willing to get involved in public policy. This was long before the change in administration, but there's been a real diminution of people wanting to participate. There's a lack of understanding of what the laws allow you to do. Nonprofits can absolutely talk about various issues. They just can't be partisan. So I think some education about what can be done and why it's important is quite critical. That's again where I would invoke my board to have a conversation about that, make sure that they don't feel that it's risky, but it's incredibly important that we all participate in the system and recognize that you can't count on somebody else doing it. There are not enough nonprofits that are engaging at this moment. So it's up to people who participate in calls like this to do this and to urge the nonprofits that all of the other leaders, the donors who are on this call, to think about making sure that their voice is heard.
100%, Stacy. And I'll add too, there were issues on our agenda and expectations for this Congress that existed before we got to January 20th and before we started talking about executive orders and federal funding and DEI and everything else that's followed. And those are still critical issues, and we can't afford to take our eye off of those. We need to help keep pushing those forward, make sure nonprofits are involved in that discussion. A big issue for us at TNPA is around data privacy and getting a federal law set for data privacy and access and use of data. We're doing work in the AI regulation because AI, as we all know, is changing absolutely everything about our lives and the way we do business, and nonprofits need to have a voice in that. We cannot afford to sit that out and let corporate interests and others make all of those decisions. And so those will continue to be critical issues this year. Just because we've piled on a lot of others doesn't mean we can afford to not worry about or postpone focus on those key ones as well.
Thank you. Okay, so we're gonna do some Q&A. First one here is from an attendee. Do we think the DEI backlash pertains to women as well? There are thousands of women's leadership programs, for example. Are those at risk?
That's a great question. I mean, the fact that I don't think it's off the table would be my answer to that. I think absolutely everything, gender, race, disability. We heard disability come up last week from the president. I mean, nothing is off the table here, even areas that we would have thought are safer spaces within DEI. So again, I would look at those programs. Stacy talked about it earlier, really get to the core of what those programs are intending to do. If it's about making sure that women have the tools and resources and access to have opportunities within leadership space, promote the program as such. Don't limit your applicants, but you will find some self-selection that may happen there. And you may also be able to build out other programs with allyship and partnership around that makes sure that you are giving equal opportunity to everyone who is interested in supporting your mission, and still continuing to do the work and reach the people that you need to reach.
Stacy, anything to add?
I agree with that.
Okay, very good. Another question here from Nancy Proctor. Are there umbrella organizations of foundations and major donors, i.e. different from the kinds of organizations represented on this panel, that meet, discuss policy, and could be resources and or lobbied for support on these issues?
Yeah, so the Council on Foundations has been very active. It's a membership organization for grant makers. So they definitely have been issuing statements and thinking about those. Grant Makers for Effective Organizations is another organization that you can tell from its name. It's grant makers that are supporting the inner workings of nonprofits to make sure that they do a good job. And you might think every donor cares about that. Of course they do. But when you're thinking about climate change, you're not necessarily doing it through the lens of how strong is the organization, what's the infrastructure. So those are groups where those conversations are happening. There are also a lot of affinity groups. ABFE, was formerly the Association of Black Foundation Executives. All of those organizations have lots of resources and are thinking about these kinds of things. So it's incredibly important for donors to be able to participate. So, I hope that you'll find more resources available. As we know more, we'll talk about those kinds of things, but donors can play a very, very active role here.
Thanks, Stacy. Shannon, anything to add?
Independent sector, yeah, there are a number of organizations that play in this space. So once you really start to search for that, they will raise their hands for you.
Yeah, and Jen, I heard that was independent sector, correct?
Independent sector, United Philanthropy Forum. I mean, and there are a lot of coalitions that exist within these groups too, and some overlap of members and interests and the work that they're prioritizing. So yes, as you start to seek out one, you'll find others. Very good.
One question from Sarah Mayer. Are you seeing changes in C4 giving or the regulatory environment as well? Any opinions on C4s?
I think C4s are already a little bit hardier in the sense of having some comfort level and some sense of freedom on really standing on positions. But everybody right now, I feel like we keep coming back to this point there, nothing is off the table right now. And I think that C4s are looking at some of these vulnerabilities or some of these risk factors in the same way that C3s are, or are closely following behind. C6s, which are associations like mine, it's, we're all looking.
Shannon, I think this question is going to be for you. Should those of us who live in blue states be contacting representatives on other side of the aisle to advocate?
A great point. So always start with the electeds from your state. They will take messages from anyone, but they are going to give the most weight and the most attention to those that are coming from your state. Now that can be where you're headquartered. It can be where your employees are. So if you have remote employees across states, look at leveraging those access points. Could be where you have programs that exist, volunteers, board members. So really look at your whole footprint. And yes, you could reach out to, particularly if you're working on an issue that is a particular passion area or particular focus for. So if you're working on gun control, for example, reaching out to Senator Murphy, just knowing who your allies and advocates are can help. But first and foremost, you're going to carry the most weight in your own state.
I talked earlier about the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation standing its ground, and one of the funders to speak out that they are against the BDI executive orders. Are there any other big foundations or other names that you've seen do similar?
There's some that are definitely thinking about also what kind of funding they might offer at this moment. So I think we're on the cusp of seeing some announcements from foundations that will be collaborative and thinking about, sort of how can they support nonprofits at this moment. So foundations can move fast, as we learned in the pandemic, when they want to. So I think there's a lot of activity. There hasn't been as much, sort of that we can all see, but I would expect to see some coalitions coming together on some of these issues. And, donors may feel more comfortable doing it that way, of working together and saying, this is what we care about, and perhaps some pooled funds to get money out the door. And, the support that they've been providing to some of these groups pursuing the lawsuits are really important. Those would not happen without philanthropy money having buttressed those organizations, making sure that they're as strong as possible.
Very good. Shannon, anything else to add before we wrap up?
No, that was great.
Okay, so that's about 2:00. Just to quickly summarize, I'm trying to do this in 30 seconds or less. We heard a lot about changing language, terminology, using data. We've heard about organizations that have changed their messaging, or some that have done the opposite and stuck to their ground. We've heard a lot about how to advocate or how to speak up and what avenues to take and where to go. We've heard a lot about what the future entails in terms of the new tax policies or what's coming from the Trump administration. We have talked a lot about diversifying funding, what to do if corporate dollars aren't there anymore. We heard some good ideas around a reserve fund, line of credit, and some other options on how to raise cash during this time, or this 90-day window. And we talked a little bit about DAFs and some endowments and some tax laws there. Thank you. That was a lot covered there. And we did get some questions in the Q&A. Will there be a summary? There absolutely will be. And if there are questions that we didn't get to, which there are a lot, we're happy to reach out individually to those folks with an answer. But long story short, thank you both, Shannon and Stacy. Wow, this was an amazing webinar, and it's also you all both took a risk, right, to be here and speak about this and give your opinion. And we really appreciate you doing that. I believe that the sector appreciates it, and I think all the 300 or so people on this call appreciate it as well. So thank you both.
Thank you for doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then last but not least, thanks for everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate the time. Again, we'll send around the video later and we'll send a summary. And then thanks to my team on the back end here that made this all happen. Really appreciate it. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of the day.